Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this webinar on public sector communications and how to decarbonise them. If you attended the webinar before, we were very much at the start of this journey, a small company looking at the complexities around the carbon we generate and how to minimise them, mitigate them, and potentially offset them. We set out the theory there, but since then, Emilia has been leading us on a journey to start getting the real picture of where we are as an organisation. And today we want to sort of really update you on that and show you where we've been, which may be useful with your own teams and with your own organisations. But also, rather excitingly, we've found some technology and developed some approaches which will help reduce the carbon emitted by all public sector communications campaigns. So those are the two things we're going to cover. Hopefully it's useful, and we should be about 20 minutes so you can get back to your lunches and your work. But I'll now just hand over to Emilia, who's going to take us through our progress as an organisation so far. Over to you, Emilia.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jean-Paul. So I'm going to just start with the boring stuff, which is the overall background of what the UK is trying to do in terms of achieving net zero. This is probably going to be old hat to many of you, but I'll just go through it quickly anyway, in case anyone is unaware. So the headlines that we should all be aware of is that the UK government is committing to achieving a really significant reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and then achieving net zero by 2050. So what net zero means is that we need to reduce our emissions as close to zero as possible, and then use carbon capture technology to remove the remaining emissions from the atmosphere. So the key distinction between that and carbon neutrality. So carbon neutrality means that we continue to emit as much carbon as we like, and we use offsetting to kind of counterbalance those emissions into the atmosphere. That will be an important distinction as we go on to thinking about CAN's approach to sustainability a bit later. So that's obviously the broad government scope there. The division into the public sector is a little bit unclear. So obviously the public sector is part of this target to achieving this large reduction by 2030 and the long-term goal of net zero. And that is going to require obviously a very deep understanding and interrogation of how the public sector impacts the environment, where public sector emissions come from, and how they can be reduced. And obviously a really key part of that, and a part that CAN really wants to support with, is in those public sector comms initiatives. So thinking about how we can decarbonize public sector comms and how we can help the public sector to therefore achieve this broader goal of achieving net zero by 2050. CAN already is providing a carbon neutral service. We've offset all our emissions from 2021 onwards, and we're going to be going beyond that offering of carbon neutrality with net zero in certain parts of our business, as I'll explain now. So headlines of where CAN is now. So in our last webinar, we went through the systems that we've set up for monitoring and measuring our emissions, the key one being our emissions monitoring system, our EMS. And through using our EMS, we found out that we emitted 68.69 tons of CO2 carbon dioxide equivalent in 2021. And we're obviously going to be using this EMS going forward to make sure that we're continuously monitoring and continuously understanding our emissions as they change over time. But as you can see in this pie chart, it's pretty clear that the vast majority of what CAN emits is through the comms campaigns we work on. So our home working, which is the majority of CAN's business emissions, the emissions that we emit just by doing business, are only 3% of our overall emissions. And in order to further understand kind of what that means for us as a company, we're going to break down our emissions into 3 scopes. So if you've not heard of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions before, I'll quickly take us through the definitions. So scope 1 are direct emissions from the company's operations. So that's if CAN owns a vehicle and we drive that vehicle, that's part of our scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions through the company's purchase of electricity, steam, and cooling. So again, if our office building uses electricity, that's part of our scope 2. And our scope 3 becomes a lot more nebulous. So this is the indirect emissions that are emitted through CAN's value chain, through our supply chain. So just by looking at this, you can see we've got a lot more direct control over our scope 1 and our scope 2 emissions. But as soon as you start to dig into your supply chain, as soon as you start to dig into those indirect emissions, which are part of your scope 3, things become infinitely more complex and infinitely less easy to control. So while we have a lot of direct control over our scope 1 and our scope 2, we don't really have any over our scope 3. And that's why scope 3 measurement has tended to be discretionary, right? So because it's a lot harder to understand, because it's a lot harder to control, a lot harder to measure, the government generally hasn't mandated measurement in scope 3. What we've done at CAN is try to go as in depth as possible into our measurement and really understand those scope 3 emissions. And that's where those ad and campaign emissions have come in. Those are all part of our scope 3. They're all part of our supply chain emissions. But going deep and understanding them has given us a much better understanding of where we are as a business in terms of emissions. And that brings us on to what we're doing about it. So as I said, the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are much easier for us to have an element of direct control over. So with those emissions, we are targeting net zero as soon as possible. So what we'll be doing is going net zero on everything that we emit in terms of our electricity, in terms of our water purchases as a company. And what we're also doing is going net zero on the elements of scope 3 that we can control. So business travel, for example, falls under scope 3. So whenever a CAN employee takes a train or uses public transport, that's all a scope 3 emission. And we really believe that we can control those emissions and therefore we can reduce them. So sorry, John Paul, you won't be taking any fancy diesel powered cars around. You'll be in a Tesla or nothing from now on. So making sure that we are going net zero on those elements of the business where we have that direct control. But where we don't have that direct control, where we're trying to measure, trying to be as complete as possible, but we can't really reduce our scope 3 as easily, we're going to be working towards carbon neutrality. So we're going to be aware of our emissions, we're going to be doing our best to reduce them, but we're going to be, at the moment, offsetting the emissions that we can't directly reduce. Obviously, the question that you might be asking is how we're measuring this, right? So how we're getting to these numbers for our scope 3 emissions, for our campaign emissions that are really hard to dig into and reduce. So when we first started interrogating CAN's emissions, trying to dig into how the company is impacting the environment, we realized that a lot of the existing tools for measuring ad emissions and measuring campaign emissions weren't really reaching the level of fidelity that we were targeting with our EMS. So our EMS, we think, is a really good summary of our emissions. We track everything really carefully. We use the government's conversion factors to convert that into carbon dioxide equivalent. So we think that it's pretty solid in terms of estimating what we're doing to the environment. But we couldn't find a similar tool for our campaign emissions. So what we did is created our own campaign emissions calculator. And what this does is it takes the exact file sizes of the ads that are placed. It calculates their file weight and the amount of electricity needed to support that file weight on the internet. And it uses that and the UK conversion factor for electricity to calculate an estimate of what that ad generates in terms of electricity when it's viewed. And we'll be using that tool to measure the impact of all our campaigns going forward, including making it available to our clients so you can understand what your campaigns are doing in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. And what you can see here in this lovely pie chart that I've added is an idea that, or the pretty obvious idea that the bigger the ad, the worse it is, right? So as you can see on the pie chart, those larger file sizes are much worse in terms of creating carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, and therefore much worse in terms of creating pollution. All right, that's my whistle-stop tour of CAN so far. So I'll hand over to John Paul to talk about how we can work to reduce those emissions.
Thank you so much, Emilia, and thank you for all the work you've done and the things you've developed, because I think there's sort of intention to do good, and then there's the steps that you take and the systems that you put in place that help you stick to that, a bit like getting fit or something like that, and you're really helping us do that. The other wonderful side of this is that in being dedicated to doing it, we've been looking for ways which we can help councils and public health bodies and all the public sector organisations that we work with take steps to critically mitigate first. If you don't emit the carbon in the first place, that's a really good place to start, and then potentially offset, but offset as little as possible. And so the ad sales team, the campaign ops team, have been looking at the areas we need to focus on to reduce these scope 3 emissions when we put campaigns together. Because, for example, video is very heavyweight creative, but it also works really well. And sometimes when you're trying to explain complex issues, you want to use it. But does this mean, being carbon net zero, does that mean that we can't use video anymore? So all these questions are in our heads. And also, will we have to reduce the effectiveness of our campaigns to reduce the carbon? That's concerning because, you then have this awkward trade-off. Do we want to achieve our foster care recruitment targets, or decarbonise our communications around foster care? And that creates an awkward challenge. So we were looking at these things, and the areas for mitigation that we're focusing on are, firstly, channel choice. Do the channels that we use generate carbon, release carbon into the atmosphere? Are there things we can do around creative, the sorts of assets we use, the weights of those assets that can help us mitigate? And then the way we deliver campaigns. If we deliver campaigns in ways that are carbon inefficient, what are the alternatives and how can we work together? So if we could just skip me on a slide, please, Emilia. We were looking at some of the most common things we see public sector organisations doing, and looking at, that there's the sort of programmatic digital online. Health and councils use a lot of outdoor, and there's a lot of direct mail that happens as well. Emilia was able to put the cost, or the carbon cost, per impression. So, for example, a leaflet being delivered and that person looking at that leaflet, someone seeing an ad in their Facebook feed or on YouTube or something like that, and then someone seeing a digital ad in out of home. And that was quite interesting. So, okay, so maybe we should be looking at what can we do digitally first before we move out to other channels. If you could pop the next slide on for me, Emilia. We've used this matrix, excluding the column on the far right, for quite a long time to help influence how campaigns are selected. So sometimes you have habits of using certain channels at certain times every year, and you just repeat those things. Or you have a data set of addresses, so the logical thing to use is direct mail. But there are all sorts of considerations when you're choosing, what percentage of the target audience are actually going to see that channel? How many times can we put messages in front of them? Particularly with behavior change, frequency is really, really important. Then obviously cost, it might be great targeting, great frequency, but the cost per interaction, the cost per impression is really, really high. Can we then, at the end of the campaign, say, we saw this correlate with outcomes? Is it measurable? What's in there? And now we're thinking, okay, is it emitting a lot of carbon? And in that, I think there's an added challenge for direct mail that makes it less attractive for us as use of the channel. But we use this grid a lot to help walk people through who are considering a range of different channels. Say, well, where should we go first? If you could do the next slide, please, Emilia. To simplify that, I often say, if you can't say it conversationally, you probably know that, use these questions when options are put in front of you. What proportion of the target audience use this channel every week? So, for example, we get asked a lot about Nextdoor, we get asked a lot about TV, radio, and so on. You know your target audience. Can the media owner or the channel provider tell you what proportion of them in your area are doing that? That often sorts a lot of wheat from chaff. And then, do you have evidence of previous costs per measured interaction? That will help you thin down again. And then you can also then apply carbon. Well, that's actually quite a carbon. So if it's not reaching a high proportion, it's not achieving high frequency, it's not measurable, and it's high carbon, really consider deprioritizing it at the planning stage, so that when your campaign comes and is delivered, the calculated carbon will be lower. If you do the next slide, please, Emilia. So the other thing to look at is what are we, as Emilia showed, larger files, more carbon emissions. So what does that mean? Well, whilst we love using video and animation, it means we're probably going to use that less at the higher up prospecting level, and instead use multivariate static ads, quite simple, non-animated, really, really short. And if you can put on the next slide, what we're thinking is at that awareness and prospecting level, you'll see an array of different, very simple, quite small file size adverts. But when people then come in and you're trying to nudge them through and they show some sort of interest in what you're doing, use video and use animation to illuminate what you're asking them to do in prime behavior. So we use video, but we use it much more efficiently. Thank you for your question, Lily. If you look, we'll share this presentation at the end, and Emilia can show how the various different ad sizes correlate with the proportion of carbon released. That there are carbon calculators that are out that can be used, and maybe Emilia will get back to you in a moment. You can explain that in more detail. So in terms of your thinking, think prospecting level, much more static, and at video level, we're only using that really in remarketing. And you'll see why in a moment. We're going to start modeling the numbers of impressions against those things at the planning stage so that we can then give an estimate of carbon and help reduce that. If you do the next slide, please. This is a piece of technology, if you just play this video, I'm sorry if you can't hear the sound, these things don't always work, that we are now signed up with called Seen This. And what they do, it's a bit like the comparison between downloading videos to a computer versus streaming from Netflix. It is far more efficient to stream ads than it is to download ads onto pages. And again, we'll share this and you should be able to hear the video when you do it. But they're doing a lot of really clever things that mean that the carbon released when your campaign is run is dramatically reduced. So if you pop it onto the next slide, I'll try and explain this in simpler form. So rather than sending video files to devices, the ads are being streamed remotely. But that also means that they apply lots of compression and monitoring. So if you're on a mobile phone, they'll send you a much lower res advert than if you're watching on a desktop or on an internet connected TV. So that mitigates a lot of carbon very, very quickly just by them being efficient about how they deliver them. So overall, you're reducing significantly the amount of data transferred. And then they also do clever things like they only deliver the video when it's in the viewport. So sometimes you get big pages of ads on newspaper sites and the whole page loads, but very few people actually scroll down the whole page. So that is a wasted ad impression, but it's also wasted carbon emissions. And they avoid that, they mitigate against that. And the other interesting thing is using this technology has a cost. So video ads are £1 per 1,000 delivery, and statics add 30 pence per 1,000 delivery. Now, that's interesting because now it sort of acts as a driver for you to think about the amount of video and stuff. You don't just spray as much video as possible. There's costs, so we're going to use it more intelligently. But does that mean performance goes down? So if we look at the next slide, happy to say no. Well, this is what got us really excited, because if we can account for the cost, the increased cost of delivering things in a carbon mitigated way, but there is no reduction in performance, and ideally performance goes up, these same approaches that help us reduce carbon, funnily enough, have the impact of increasing performance. So reduction, a fifth reduction in cost per action or cost per outcome, increased conversion rates because the videos are loading faster through using the streaming technology, much higher click-through rates because people are seeing more videos, seeing more of the message and pushing it through. And on statics as well, generally, you're seeing much better interaction rates because they're loading faster, they're loading only in the viewpoint, you're getting less wastage. So taking a carbon mindset and applying it to how you deliver campaigns should mean that you get a reduced cost per outcome, which is wonderful. So we should be doing this anyway, regardless of whether our carbon reduction objectives. Could you pop the next slide on for me, Emilia? So often behaviour change comes with firstly thinking about things, and I thought it'd be, based on what we've learned, useful to say, well, look, here's some things to think about, and to think about frequently when you're running campaigns. We expect, depends on your organisation. You may already be being asked for this, but you're going to be asked, your activities, what carbon do they generate, and what did they generate last year, and what are you doing to mitigate the carbon released from future campaigns? So start to prepare, start to think about it, and we can really help you do that, and use carbon calculators and things like that. But then also adopt this idea that the carbon element isn't, well, it is an added complexity, but it's a welcome one because it forces a lot of really strong behaviours. Reducing wastage. You don't want to be spending money and carbon delivering messages to people that can never interact with them, that they're just not appropriate for. So certainly reduce wastage, but then all of these, the tech elements actually improve campaign performance as well. It also requires, if you're going to measure what happened before and what you're going to do to what happens in the future, it really gives you a strong incentive to work with services to forward plan a lot more. What are you expecting to do? When are you expecting to do it? What are the audiences? You can have conversations under the guise of, yes, just planning to deliver good service, but also planning to mitigate carbon. It might give you another reason to speak to a director to give you their plans sooner, which is what a lot of comms teams we speak to really want to happen. It also gives you another opportunity, not just that digital is measurable and more effective and things like that, but also you've got to reduce the carbon from, for example, doing that mail out that you do every year, or using these channels, which we know aren't measurable, quite expensive, but also release a lot of carbon. I mean, even digital screens and things like that. We've really got to think, are we getting to the right people, and are we doing it in a way that isn't releasing carbon? So we can accelerate the move away from channels that we sort of know aren't that effective. And then the point to prove is that it reduces cost per outcome overall. You've got the mitigation of better targeting, use of more efficient channels. But what we're doing at the moment is we're proving it. A lot of this is data we've collated from other places. We're now running a test in Dorset with their fostering team, where we're doing how we would have normally done the campaign, and then how we plan the campaign using the various carbon mitigation technologies and approaches, and to see what the difference is in performance. The bottom level we need to achieve is it the same? Are we using this technology, mitigating carbon, and getting the same performance? But there are a lot of indicators, a lot of case studies out there showing that performance should actually increase, which is then a wonderful win-win. It's a win for fostering, it's a win for the environment. Can we look at the next slide, please? So what could some of the actions be if you embrace this idea and want to move with it in your team? I would connect with the team responsible for carbon reduction. They might be climate team, they might be in charge of environment. Speak to them and talk about how communications, how they're asking the organisation to measure carbon, and how what communications can do, and then start to look at all communications activity previously, maybe using accounting. You can use the invoice, the purchase orders that you've raised, and then commit to planning in the future to reduce that. Whatever you find, reduce it and move from there. So that then when you're asked, you have a plan and you're on it. What you really need is an Emilia, for someone who's going to control it for you and help on that front. Make sure what you're doing aligns with carbon reduction commitments, and also when the organisation communicates those carbon reduction commitments, make sure you're doing it in a way that reduces carbon as well. I think that's really important. Imagine retrospective scrutiny preparing for that is key too. Use it as an opportunity to have conversation with services to nudge forward planning. We've got the remainder of this financial year, but we're also really thinking about next financial year. We'll start thinking about November and December. Use this as an approach. Say, look, you think about the carbon you produce as a service, but also when you communicate, we're going to help you reduce that too. It's another way of having conversation, could prompt some good behavioural outcomes in terms of the relationship with the services. Planning is then going to become more key. So you're having that future conversation, but then to map out and to start to balance what you're talking about. And then above that, you're probably going to need a plan of plans. So what I mean by that, if you look at the next slide, you'll have a campaign like this where we can look at spend, we can then look at the creatives, we can look at what's being delivered, and we can apply carbon mitigation to that. But you need the forward plan in order to do it beforehand, before you start working. You also need that so that at the end of the campaign, you can say, this is what we achieved. It might have cost this in 2020, but now in 2023, it's cost the same, delivered more outcomes, and we've reduced the carbon. You want to be able to report on that and keep telling that story. But also, we think there is another sort of meta layer above this. If you look at the next slide, having these conversations with people will mean that you'll have a data set, which means you can see a plan of plans. And there might be some really strong cross-pollinations between those plans. We think, for example, around public health, local economy, and environment, there are some wonderful super behaviors. Shopping locally, for example, at zero-waste shops, using greengrocers rather than supermarkets. There are all these wonderful behaviors that you can nudge together as public health, as local economy campaigns, and as carbon reduction. You have active travel, which has an environment impact, but also potentially a mental health, physical health, and local economy impact as well. So your plan of plans is helping you see what's coming up and where you could make those connections. Is there an environmental aspect to this campaign? Are we reducing the carbon and all of these things? And are we optimizing the potential cross-pollination between, for example, in a low activity behavior change campaign and a shop local campaign and an active travel campaign from highways? So we think with all of these efficiencies, yes, you can definitely reduce carbon, but we can also really drive performance. So use the agenda of your organization to accelerate efficiencies, and that should help you achieve a lot more with a lot less. I think that's it. I think there's just one final slide with contact details on, but if anyone here wants to have a conversation for us to illuminate more of what we're doing, our approach, please get in touch with any of us. We've got Alan, who's a new member of the team, recently joined us from Enfield, London Borough of Enfield. There's Matt, who's a really strong specialist in public health and in children's social services campaigns. And there's obviously me, who I'll be able to at least point you to some expertise somewhere. So thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you again, Emilia, for the work you're doing and helping us get to this place. And we will update you, we'll keep you informed. We'll let you know how this is progressing, how the Dorset trial goes, how it's working in other campaigns, and we'll share what we're finding out with you all. Thanks again, and hope you have a wonderful rest of day.